Alright, welcome back. It's been a while since the last video. I haven't moved houses. This is my new room. Empty wall, whiteboard. Not using papers anymore. We're doing this in the moment. Last episode, Lenin's imperialism. This episode is going to be the first part of a various part series on Marx's Capital. This book has a bit of controversy in some aspects, just in the sense of how relevant is Marx's Capital still today? This book was written around 130 years ago. How could Marx's Capital, something written that long ago, still be relevant to us today? And I still think it's relevant, highly relevant, for various reasons. Firstly, methodology. The ways, the tools that Marx uses and gives us in order to analyze society and history is of utmost importance and highly used, for example, in this book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which is why I thought it was relevant to use it as a little microphone today, because Walter Rodney in this book uses the same sort of methodology that Marx uses in order to understand and get to the deep roots of what is capital, this mode of production, this system that has a lot of veils behind it, has a lot of mystery behind the appearances of different things. Marx gets his methodology from dialectics, which is systematized by Hegel in his Science of Logic. But unlike Hegel, Marx doesn't analyze the movement of change, which is what dialectics consists of, how the nature of change, how things move throughout time. But instead of using and seeing the movement of change of concepts, Marx gets actual historical things, which is how we get to dialectical materialism, historical materialism, which, unlike Hegel, who traces the sequence of logic, Marx, in this case, chases the sequence of capital. And in this first chapter especially, traces how commodities come to be, the nature of commodities, and how they define the system of production that we currently live in and the social relations which exist within it. Lenin said, if we don't understand the totality of Hegel's Science of Logic, we won't begin to understand Marx's first chapter of commodity. I haven't read Hegel's Science of Logic. I've tried reading his shorter logic, so we're going to take Lenin's advice as a little footnote for later on, not to dismiss his advice, but as a future reference. For now, we're going to try and tackle this with what we know and slowly go through the capital, which is a pretty daunting task, and try and see what can we get out of it? What does Marx teach us? And what are the things that we can use from it to apply to today? So without further ado, let's run the intro and let's get into it. So, Marx's chapter 1 is called, as we've said a million times right now, the commodity. So Marx starts off by telling us the wealth of societies is built up by an appearance of an accumulation of commodities, right? That's the first sentence of the book. And he says, first, to understand this, we have to analyze what a commodity is. Let's get the particular. So Marx says that the commodity has a dual nature. Within the commodity exists two different things, two different faces, right? Embodied within this. The first thing that we have is a use value, which is something that's existed throughout history, right? I have a cup which I use to drink water out of. I have a pen that I use to write on this whiteboard. I have a whiteboard in order to explain the ideas. These different items have a use that I want it for, right? That give reason to it. If we go back in time, we grew food in order to eat. Corn is able to eat, etc., etc. It's defined by the physical properties of the thing, which make it useful. Simple as that, right? Physical nature and usefulness. On the other side, we have exchange value. Exchange value is how much the thing is. How much of my commodity do I have to give to have your commodity? But this is when it gets a bit complicated, because how do we measure the nature of exchange value? How do we know how much my thing is worth versus how much your item is worth. Say I have pens and I want the book that you have. How do we know how much we can exchange it for each other? What Marx says is that the defining thing that exists within all commodities, because of course I can't compare the physical nature of this pen with that of a book. I'm going to use it for two completely different things. So that's not going to be the basis of our measurement of value. But what exists within all these commodities, all these things that are useful, is labor. It needs human labor power in order to make it. I need to be able to know how to write, how to sew, how to do all these different things to make a book. I need to know how to put the ink in this. I need to know how to make the lid, whatever. These are all the physical natures of labor, but what all commodities share is that they all have labor power. So the substance of exchange value within a commodity is the labor that's embedded in it. So then, if we know that the substance of exchange value is labor, how can we define the how much question, the magnitude? Well, if the substance is labor, then the magnitude necessarily is going to be defined by the labor time. How much time does it make to make X commodity? How long does it take me to make this pen versus how long does it take you to make that book? The form in which these exist is exchange value. So far, a little recap. Commodity has a dual nature. It has its use value, which is the physical properties of a thing which make it useful, and it has its exchange value, which is the measurement of how much a thing is worth, which is defined by the labor that's congealed in it. The labor time is how much we decide the thing is worth. But then what does that necessarily mean? It means that all types of labor, tailoring, weaving, making a matcha latte in your gentrified cafe, all of these things, their physical properties, are alienated from the work. The only thing that matters is the labor, which we're going to call abstract human labor instead of useful or concrete human labor. So, as I mentioned now, labor has these two different facets to it, similarly to commodity. Labor has the useful labor, which is the specific physical labor that is needed to make a certain commodity. So if I'm making a coffee, I need to know how to steam milk, right? Writing a book, I need to know what I'm writing about, hopefully. You know what I mean? So all of these specific physical aspects of the thing that you're creating. But on the other side, labor is also abstract human labor in the social sense of the term. So when I go to the world of commodities, when I'm going to give my pen and you're going to give me your book, the way that these commodities are going to quote unquote talk to each other is through the labor that's embedded in them, the abstract human labor. So, for example, let's say that I make 5 pens. I make 5 pens. And I go into the market and I want a book. And I find the bookmaker in the time that it took me to make 5 pens, it took him to make one book. So we're measuring it on the magnitude of time. But these proportions that we have here, 5 to 1, are inversely proportional. And here is one of the main contradictions that we're going to see within labor. So let's say this is in one day's work, right? It takes me one day to make 5 pens. It takes me one day to write a book, to make a book, whatever the case may be. Now imagine that the productivity time of labor for writing the book halves, meaning that the person writing the book is able to pump them out much faster. Imagine Bradley Cooper in that movie where he takes that insane drug and he's just on one and he's doing all this shit because he's cracked out. That's basically the idea. instead of one book in one day, now we have 2 books in one day. But what does that mean? If now I make 2 books in one day, this formula changes. Now it's 5 pens to 2 books, which is really 2.5 pens with 1 book. This happened because the productivity of writing or making books increased. Now let's take another example. Let's say now I'm making pens. My machine explodes, or all the machines of the pen makers go to shit for some reason. And instead of making 5 pens in one day, I end up making 5 pens in 2 days. Now what I'm gonna get instead of this is I'm gonna get this. 2.5 pens for 1 book. We get the same equation, but for 2 completely different reasons. One reason, the productivity of books halved, meaning we got it way faster. But on the other side, we had that the pens, the productivity doubled, meaning it took twice the time in order to make the thing, which goes kind of in contrast with the usefulness of labor. The more productive I get with my work, the less the item that I'm selling is worth, because we're measuring it with the magnitude of labor time. If I can make more of a thing, it's going to depreciate in value. Perfect. So now we've kind of gotten into the nature of commodity, fact that it has a dual nature within it. It's two-phased. It has the use value, but also the exchange value. And this value is socially determined. It's not inherently within the commodity, but it is determined by labor. Abstract human labor, labor of all sorts, whether it's tailoring, weaving, steeping milk, all of these labors are congealed in the commodity that they're making. Perfect. So then commodities are now talking to each other in this abstract human labor form, which is symbolized in value, in the value of the commodity. So then what Marx says, now that we've unveiled the mystery of the value of commodity, now Marx sets us to the task of unveiling the origin of money and how money comes to be. And what he says is that the germ of the money form is in the simple value form, which we saw before. So let's look at this. So the simple value form looks something like this. X commodity A equals Y commodity B, which in the examples we used before could mean 5 pens equals 1 book. In the book, Marx uses the example of 20 yards of linen equals 1 coat. But I think it's cool to switch up the examples just to keep it away from linen and coats and that. Although they're great examples, but regardless, it's not that important. What Marx says is that in this simple value form, we have 2 different roles being played. On the left side, X commodity A is the relative form, while on the other side, commodity B, we have the equivalent form. One of them, relative form, is being active, while the other one is being passive. Now, what does that mean? Basically, what that means is I'm in my tailor shop and I'm making pens, right? I'm putting ink from here, whatever. I don't know how to make pens, but the idea is that I'm making pens in my shop, in my tailor room. And at the end of the day, I have 5 pens, right? And I want to exchange it for something, but I don't know what the value of my pens are, because I can't do 5 pens equals 5 pens or 1 pen equals 1 pen, because that can mean anything, right? It could take me 10 hours to make a pen, but it could take me 10 minutes. So I don't really have a reference within the commodity itself to find its value. So then pens have to look around in the world of commodity. The producer, really, the pen's not doing anything, but the producer has to find a commodity which can reflect the value of the pen. So, in simpler terms, in other words, the pen, in order to find out its value, has to find it in another commodity. So now, the pens are expressing their own value in book. The pens are finding and expressing their value in what the book is. The book is not determining anything. The book is only the material embodiment, the physical representation of the pen's values. The only purpose that the book has is for its use value, the book itself, to represent the exchange value of the pens. And so now the pens have an understanding of what its value is because the book is serving as the embodiment, the visual representation of its value. What this proves to us is really interesting because this is the external representation of the commodity itself. We have commodity A, which is the use value of it all, the thing that's being made, and is represented in the book, which is its exchange value, right? In this simple value form, we have the relative form and the equivalent form. The relative form has its value expressed in the equivalent form, and the equivalent form is working as the material embodiment of commodity A. Because without the equivalent form, the relative form will never actually understand what it is worth. Then what happens? This book is completely alienated from its use value. And as much as we want to search in the book, we're not going to find its value in it. But what its use value is working for is this embodiment of the pen's value. But why can they be equivalent to each other? This is the crux of it all. Because they both have human labor congealed in them. Whether it's writing or whether it's pen making is irrelevant. It's abstract human labor, which is why these two things can be equated to each other. Moving on from the simple form of value, we go to the extended form of value. Instead of just having two accidental commodities which equal one another, we have an extended form of value, which in our case will be 5 pens equals 1 book, or 10 forks equals, I don't know, like a flat white in your gentrified coffee. Now we have this relative form, the pens, which has a bunch of different equivalent forms, right? Its value is embodied in 1 book, or 10 forks, 1 flat white, 2 cups, 5 tickets to a show. Those would be pretty cheap tickets, but you get what I mean. Their equivalent form is represented in a lot of different things, right? Because they all have, once again, human labor congealed in them. But this gets a bit messy, right? Because where everything's in equivalent form, if I'm in the world of commodities, I don't want to have to be thinking my value can be represented in a flat white, but it'll also be in a water bottle. So then this needs a bit more stability. But think about what we were saying. If 5 pens was the relative value and everything else was the equivalent form, and all of these are the equivalent form, why don't we flip it around and make all of these the relative and this pens the equivalent form, which is where we get our general form of value. Boom. Now we have one solid commodity which works as the equivalent. And this commodity's sole role is to play the role of the equivalent. The book, the forks, the flat white, the tickets, the cups, etc., are all going to find their value embedded in the pens. There's going to be a single unified commodity which is going to express the value of all these different things. So now it's going to be way more easier to have the book and the forks in exchange because now we have a solid representation which all the commodities can talk into. And this is a huge point because we've dialectically jumped around from the simple form to the extended form to the general form to find that the necessity to have one single uniform commodity stems from the exchange of all these different commodities, for a commodity needing an external body to express its value. So then what happens? We've been using the example of pens, but then if we go into the historical framework of it, we then have the money form, which in history, instead of using pens, what we used was gold. Gold wasn't the money commodity because it's embedded in it. Gold could only become the commodity, the money commodity, because it served as a commodity beforehand. Gold was used to make jewelry, gold was used to make rings, to make all these luxurious items. But gold's physical properties, being able to be divided with much more ease and able to make and shape and cut into many different aspects, made it a perfect commodity to be used as an exchange, as a money form. But gold in itself doesn't have any natural properties which make it good for exchange. It just so developed after historical circumstances for it to be the commodity. And this is the brilliance of Marx, right? He walked us through the simple form, which is not just some random concept, but it's a historical happening where before, when I was in my farm and this other person was in their shop and they were making their things to be able to sustain themselves, any over residue of the thing they were making, they'd be able to trade. I had extra 5 pence, that person had an extra book. We had this accidental, occasional exchange, which wasn't the determining factor in society. But then we move into the extended form of value, right? In the real world example, we have cattle or milk. Milk was used more often. So then milk was exchanged for a variety of different things, right? Milk was exchanged for corn because the person was making corn wanted milk, but it still wasn't the main basis of production. But the moment that we have commodities as the main source of production and we're producing to make commodities and not just to sustain ourselves, that's when it's necessary. And when we have a constant exchange of commodities and products, is when we need a commodity to serve as the universal exchange. And this didn't just happen overnight, but gold ultimately ended up getting the social monopoly on the money commodity form, which now is in the paper form or in credit cards or invisible, right? But because the symbolic nature of it is already established, we've already been doing this for now centuries, so we're able to have a symbolic representation of what this commodity, which is the equivalent form, is. But these things didn't happen, weren't born out of thin air, but rather they were born out of historical constructs, which is what Marx is working with. Marx is working with reality and not concepts. Amazing. So, we got most of it, right? We just talked about the commodity, its dual nature, and how it has its use value, the physical nature of it, the thing that makes it useful, and its exchange value, which alienates its physical properties, and the value of the commodity is determined by the labor embodied in it. And how much the thing is worth, the magnitude of it, is determined by how long it takes to make, which is inversely proportional with the productivity. If I used to make able to make one book in one day, now I can make two, then the value of the book has gone down. Then after that, we got into the forms of value, and we got into four, but really three, which was the simple form of value, which importantly has the relative form and the equivalent form. The relative form, which has its value embodied in the other commodity, because it's impossible to find value within yourself as a commodity. And the equivalent form, which serves as the material embodiment of the other commodity's value, which is so important to understand in its simplest form, because that's how we get to the money form. By having a material embodiment of the other commodity's value is how we get to have a money form which serves as the equivalent of all the commodities that we have. What Marx has done here in these 40 pages, what this system of production does, it puts a lot of smoke screens behind the actual nature of its things, right? And this is where Marx calls this fetishism, commodity fetishism. Fetishism, giving the commodity superpowers, right? Things that are kind of mysterious to it in a sort of religious way. The commodity now, instead of being a product of labor, is this kind of thing that's living, right? It's making its own choices. It's kind of going around the world of commodities on itself, rather than actually, as we've seen before, being a product of labor. What this commodity fetishism is trying to do is try to make all of these systems of production and all of their relations, the production and the distribution of commodities, seem to appear as a natural thing, as something that's been happening forever and not really changed. Basically, remove it from its historical context. As we saw before, when we had a family of farmers, right? When they were making their um, products, when they were making food to eat close to where, all of these were things that they needed. They were creating for their own subsistence, right? And we had different labor times for these different things. Maybe it took longer to make the clothes, longer to do the corn, whatever, but they had different roles and different tasks that were assigned. And they were all mainly for their own survival in order to keep on living, right? That's been the majority of human history. But let's move on forward to a group of like free people, right? And they all join and they all have in mind that they're this one social group of labor, but they all are doing different things, right? And what they have, they keep for their own survival, and the rest they exchange to sustain their means of production, right? You need to invest in order to keep things running. You need to have seeds in order to make the ship, blah, 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 right? For means of production and for their own survival, right? It's only when we have these capitalists, these bourgeois people that create commodities in the real sense of the word to for the sole purpose of selling them, right? And this only happens at a social point of development where the means of production are at a certain level, and it comes at a different point of social relations where these individual producers find themselves in the world of commodities, and they socially interact through their commodities. They socially interact through the labor time that's put in by the producers into those different objects, which are now commodities. But that's not something which is inevitable. It's not something which is in the nature, but rather it's something that was developed out of something else and was purposefully constructed. Exchange value, as we saw, isn't born out of nothing, isn't inherent. When I plant a carrot, I won't open the carrot and find the price in the carrot, but rather it's a social interaction between all the different commodities. Capitalism in this way works similarly to religion. We give this supernatural value to things that we created. I create this phone, but this phone and its value, which might change its magnitude, is not dependent on anything of labor time, but rather this commodity has a life of its own, which is the same thing as, for example, like when they say, oh, you put 100 euros in a bank and now after a month it's going to be 110, as if capital or money organically grows like trees. But what we know now is that money doesn't grow on trees. Money grows from labor. Commodities are produced from labor, and any production of money which seems to be divorced from that reality is commodity fetishism. It's giving objects, it's talking about the world of commodities and their exchange as if it's a world of objects relating to each other rather than producers exchanging with each other and congealed labor time talking with each other. Amazing. That's Capital Volume 1's first chapter, the commodity. Let's kind of trace through what we talked about. We talked about the commodity in its dual form, value and exchange value. Use value is the thing that makes it worth, kind of purposeful, the thing that makes it, and its word, useful. Exchange value is What makes it valuable? And what did we say makes something valuable? What do all commodities have in common? Labor. Labor is the substance of all exchange value. And how do we determine the magnitude? We determine it by labor time. How long does it make to make the thing? It's the crux of the question. Can a commodity find its own value? No. Now we get to the crux of the question. How does a thing find its value? I can't find the value of a pen in a pen, right? I can't find the value of a thing within itself. I can only find it if the value is embodied in something else, right? A mirror of the value, which is the example we used before with the 5 pens in the book. We have the 5 pens, which is the relative form, and we have the 1 book, which is the equivalent form. The equivalent form serves as the physical body of the pen's value. And this has value expressed in equivalent form. Whatever the body of the equivalent form may be, we could be talking about books, we could be talking about cups, we could be talking about shoes, we could be talking about million different commodities. We need its physical body as the representation of this thing's value, which, after exploring and digging further, we get to the money form. Money form doesn't arrive out of nothing. Gold doesn't have a natural property which makes it the equivalent form of all these different commodities, but rather, after the quantity of commodities becomes bigger and bigger, the quality of the system changes, right? The abundance of commodities makes it, and the mode of production makes it, right? The intent is not any longer to sustain myself. My intent is to produce in order to sell, in order to give that exchange value. That's where we get the money form. We need something which can embody the value of all a wide array of commodities. So then we have 1 book, 5 pens, 10 forks, blah, 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 all embodied in money form, which at one point historically was gold because it was malleable, because it was easy to change whatever. Now in the paper form, as the sort of paper form, or even now digital form, right? It's in the banks, whatever. This is just the symbolic representation of the money form. But gold only worked as a commodity before because it used to be on this side. It used to be a relative form. But now, because of its characteristics, because of its physical characteristics, it was then used as the money commodity. But behind all of these things, behind all of this, right, this exposition that Marx gives us, capitalism puts mysticism behind all of this. No, actually, exchange value is born out of the carrot, right? Even though you can't see it, even though no chemist has found that broccoli has exchange value in the roots, doesn't matter, right? These forms of production, these things aren't natural, right? And even if now, because people found that the value was labor time before Marx, right? People found that labor was determined by value before Marx, but in the same way that gravity, right, was discovered, but a lot of these capitalists treated it as gravity, treated it as this natural thing that exists. Of course, these modes of production exist. Of course, these social relations of production exist, right? It's something that's embedded within the nature of production and distribution. And Marx is like, no. What all of this is built on is a historical point in which the modes of production have reached a certain point, and also the social relations of production have reached, where it's individual producers exchanging their commodities with other commodities. And I'm producing in order to make commodities. I'm producing in order to sell, not producing in order to eat. Just two completely different things. A great follow-up to all of this is in here. Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, which is only through the absolute ravaging of these civilizations, of their lands, of slavery, is how Europe, Western Europe, was able to develop these modes of production and start developing capitalism at a stage because it pillaged a lot of these things, which is why gold isn't born out of nothing. When the Spanish and the Portuguese go to Peru and they go to Brazil to find gold, when they go to the Gold Coast, Africa, it's because there's a desperate need for gold in order to have more money, in order to buy all of these things. But gold just was the social monopoly at the time. Gold still has value, obviously, but it's not the main form of commodity as the equivalent form all over the world. All of this to say, all of this has an historical existence, historical base. It's not born out of nothing. Money doesn't arise from the trees, but it is rather through the work embodied in commodities, through the exploitation of labor, which is where we're going to get to, that money is created. Amazing. Cool. This is, once again, a brief summary. Video after this, part 2. So if you don't have your copy yet, you can choose the edition one. I have this one, Penguin's Classic one. It's pretty worn out at this point. But let's get into it. Until next time.